I recently asked my audience which episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation they considered to be the best, and one of the titles that consistently came up was
Darmok. Darmok.
And I found it interesting that of all the great episodes in this series, stories about time travel, battles with the Borg, mysterious anomalies, people chose a story about language as their favorite. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look at this episode because I think at its heart, this story about two people struggling to find common ground defines the spirit of Star Trek The Next Generation overall. If you were a first-time viewer of Star Trek, one of the first questions you might have is, why do all the aliens speak English? And for this, Star Trek provides something of an answer. The universal translator is capable of instantly translating any spoken language into the user's native tongue in most cases. Without this little plot convenience, Star Trek could not exist. But it is one of those things that you wonder about when you're watching, because the reality is that language is extremely complicated, and it's seldom a one-to-one conversion of one word or phrase into its semantically equal counterpart. According to Star Trek lore, the translator is built into a range of devices like comm badges and tricorders, which communicate with an ear implant. But this is never really spelled out in the show. If you've ever wondered why Klingon words sometimes don't get translated, the in-universe explanation is that Klingons find the translator dishonorable. Now, Darmok, I've always believed, was in part an attempt to actually explore the challenges language would pose to a spacefaring civilization. But that said, I don't think that's what the story is fundamentally about, because the reality is that language is also a problem for us earthbound humans, and always has been. So the episode begins with the crew meeting to discuss their upcoming encounter with an enigmatic race called the Children of Tama. This race has been encountered by the Federation 7 times in 100 years, and in each encounter they were incomprehensible. Now, despite this, Picard seems confident that through the power of dialogue they can develop a relationship.
In my experience, communication is a matter of patience, imagination.
But the encounter proves fruitless because the Tamarian speech is just impossible to understand. The universal translator does the literal translation, meaning it handles the grammar and syntax of the language just fine. But the Tamarians speak primarily in metaphor, using proper nouns to reference specific people and places that the translator has no context for. The Tamarians, frustrated by the failed discussion, decide to transport both captains to the surface of a nearby planet. The Tamarian captain, Dathan, has 2 blades, so Picard naturally assumes this is a duel. But it soon becomes apparent that Dathan has something else in mind. He's not aggressive, and in fact helps Picard to start a fire when it gets cold at night.
Timber. His arms wide.
Dathan continues to speak in metaphor, with one particular phrase coming up more often than any other.
Darmok and Shalard at Tanagra.
Now, back aboard the Enterprise, after a rescue attempt is thwarted by the otherwise idle Tamarian vessel, Troy and Data make some progress in figuring out that the name Darmok refers to a mytho-historic hunter in Tamarian culture. Troy explains that it would be like an English speaker using an expression like Juliet at her balcony to express the concept of love. Now, personally, I would illustrate this by saying that the Tamarians kind of speak in memes. Here's a few classics that I often use in text conversation. Now, if you were from an alien race and didn't know their cultural context, you wouldn't really understand their meaning, even if you could see and understand superficially what the images are. Anyway, despite making progress, the crew is having the same problems as Picard and is becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to communicate. They're kind of on edge because at any moment, a misunderstanding could escalate into violence. Down on the planet, it's revealed that there's some kind of predator-like beast that's hunting Picard and Dathan, so Picard finally accepts the blade. But it's too late. Dathan is critically wounded by the beast when Picard is rendered immobile by a failed transporter attempt. And it's here in the story where I think this episode really shines. It's the scene in which Picard finally begins to understand that the Tamarians speak by citing their own mythology. Big shout out here to Paul Winfield, the actor who somehow manages to convey some really profound emotion through all of that Tamarian makeup, to say nothing of the limitations of his dialogue. By the way, this is not his only appearance in Star Trek. And the critical moment in the story comes when Picard realizes that the best way to reach Dathan is to speak his language by citing his own mythology. So he recounts the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest stories in human memory. Now, one thing I love about this scene is that the camera stays on Dathan while Picard is telling the story, which is really counterintuitive if you think about it. I mean, this is the great Captain Picard, played by the great Patrick Stewart, giving a powerful speech. And a director's first instinct would surely be to feature Patrick Stewart's performance. But the director of this episode had the wisdom and insight to focus on Dathan listening rather than Picard speaking. And wow, what a wonderful creative decision this is. It not only captures the subtle and profound performance from Paul Winfield, but it also expresses the moral of the story. See, this entire story is about listening. It's about trying to understand people who are different. And though the focus of the episode is Picard's attempt to understand Dathan, in this moment, the story brings us into Dathan's understanding of Picard. This is really TNG at its finest, and this scene is why I think this episode kind of defines the show's spirit and ethic overall. There are a lot of well-written shows on television, captivating stories with great characters and beautiful cinematography, but the storytelling in Star Trek: The Next Generation has wisdom. It actually teaches important lessons about life and being human. Now, Dathan does not survive his injury, and through his sacrifice, Captain Picard is able to return to the Enterprise, speak to the Temerians, show them that he respects their culture and way of life, and de-escalate the conflict. So the meaning of the story is pretty clear. So much of the suffering that humanity has endured through the ages comes down to a failure of understanding. And if we could all just recognize that and approach our differences with humility and respect, we'd probably find that much of the conflict in our world is simply unnecessary. But I would say Darmok goes even deeper than that because it centers language as its subject. And the fact is that we're not so different from the Temerians. We may not speak exclusively in metaphor like the Temerians do, but consider, Echo is the name of a mountain nymph cursed by Hera to repeat only the last words spoken to her. Mentor is the name of the wise advisor appointed to teach the son of Odysseus. Chaos is that which existed before the creation of the universe. English language makes all kinds of mythological references, whether we're conscious of it or not, and conflicts between and among cultures on Earth are so often the result of historical divisions between groups of people, many of which could be bridged by shared culture and shared language. So as that message is simmering in your mind nearing the end of this episode, the story ends with Picard holding the blade, looking out his ready room window into space, and saluting Dathan's sacrifice. Not the sacrifice of a warrior, which is so often the case, but the sacrifice of a communicator, one who saw and understood the necessity of shared understanding. So what an incredible 45 minutes of television, and I think it's clear to see why Darmok ranks at the top of the list of best TNG episodes. So, Tamba, his arms wide, check out my Patreon if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.